When we all learned the basic fundamentals of Magic the Gathering, we started with once per turn, you play a land. That land can be tapped to make mana. That mana can be used to cast spells. But this isn't basic Magic the Gathering, this is vintage. We break those fundamentals. Welcome to Vintage Vanguard, where I introduce you to the 11 most played decks in Vintage. Today, CounterVine. Welcome back to the second episode of Vintage Vanguard, where I introduce you to the 11 most played decks in Vintage from A to Z. Today, I will show you a true Vintage special with CounterVine. CounterVine is a unique tempo control deck that forgoes the classic Magic mana base and instead plays Bazaar of Baghdad and a variety of cards that can be played for 0 mana. This deck requires Bazaar of Baghdad to be in your opening hand to function, so you must mulligan to the card, and you have Serum Powder to help you out there and guarantee that your opening hand has at least one Bazaar. Bazaar on the surface may look like a terrible land. It doesn't produce mana, and you discard more cards than you draw. But don't worry, we can break both of those issues apart using cards printed throughout Magic's 30-year history. We don't need Bazaar to produce mana if none of our cards cost mana to cast. We can turn card discarding into card advantage using cards that return on every upkeep or cards that cost 0 when they're discarded. Our main way to turn +2 into -3 from a negative to a positive are Squee, Goblin Nabob, which returns on every one of your upkeeps, and Master of Death for 1 life, which also returns on your upkeep. If we start pitching one of these cards every turn to Bazaar, our Bazaar going from +2 -3 to +2 -2 turned it into a Faithless Looting on every turn. Faithless Looting is a card banned in Modern, and we get that for free on every turn. And 1 Squee or Master of Death is not the max. We can have up to 3 get pitched to our Bazaar every turn. With 3 getting pitched every turn, our Bazaar turns into tap, draw 2. By turning our Bazaar into card advantage, as long as we have access to it and the graveyard, we can effectively play a controlling game plan. We're going to use counterspells in an overwhelming number to stop our opponent from playing Magic the Gathering. We've got 4 Force of Will, free counterspell when you pitch a blue card, 4 Force of Negation, the same, 4 Subtlety, which can pseudo counter a creature card by pitching another blue card, Mindbreak Trap, a free exile counter spell when they play at least 3 spells in the same turn, Force of Vigor, a free destroy 2 artifacts and enchantments just by pitching a green spell, and of course, Mental Misstep, just free counter a 1-drop. You may notice that many of our counter spells cost an additional spell to cast. What they have to do is exile a card to help pay for the 0 mana cost. These cards are typically called pitch spells by most experienced Magic players, and they are considered card disadvantage. But if we gain enough card advantage with our Bazaar plus Squee combo, we can offset the card disadvantage of playing pitch spells and effectively just have them be free counter spells. We'll pair our free counter spells with Wasteland, another free action that will help you disrupt your opponent's game plan to grind them to a halt where they don't have enough mana and they are getting outvalued by paying mana to cast spells while we are not paying mana to cast spells. As long as we have this engine going, the opponent will suffer a huge tempo loss. That being said, tempo is only good for buying time. If you don't back up your tempo plan with creatures, it will not work. So we have some extremely efficient attacking creatures in this deck to help reduce our opponent's life total to 0. Hollow 1 is going to be a 0 mana 4/4 after we discard 3 cards to Bazaar of Baghdad. Basking Root Walla and Blazing Root Walla both cost 0 when you cast them off of Madness, off of the Bazaar of Baghdad discard. And when you cast these 12 free creature spells, if you cast 2 in the same turn with a Vengevine in the yard, which you discarded to Bazaar of Baghdad, this card will return from the yard with haste to attack for 4. Being able to play multiple creature spells for free that have 4 power and some of them have haste can produce extremely fast kills. This deck can kill as early as turn 2 with certain Vengevine draws. Backing up a turn 2 attacking kill with a pile of free counter magic, this deck poses an extreme threat to the blue decks of the format. Hearing all this, you might ask the question, Justin, you just told me this deck is a pile of free creatures, free counter magic. That just sounds too good to be true. And you're right. There is a downside to playing this deck. This deck hinges entirely on Bazaar and access to the graveyard. If your Bazaar or access to the graveyard is disrupted, your deck does not work. We need to have insurance against a variety of hate pieces you might experience when playing in the Vintage metagame. In our main, we have 4 Noxious Revival, a free spell that returns a card from graveyard to the top of library. This can return our Bazaar of Baghdad after it's been wastelanded and gives us an additional way to recover our Bazaar. It can also be used as disruption. Putting a card that an opponent doesn't want on the top of their library can effectively tempo them out of an entire turn. An entire turn might be the difference between you reducing their health total to 2 or their health total to 0. Some versions of CounterVine may even play Petrified Field, a land that returns a land from the graveyard to the hand. This card is very specifically here to rebuy your Bazaar of Baghdad. Our whole deck hinges on it. We can't let it be destroyed. We have Force of Vigor, 4 of them in the 75, as a way to answer a variety of hate pieces. Many decks will play Leyline of the Void, Pithing Needle, and our sideboard needs to be geared to mitigate the toughest answers. Force of Vigor is a free way to remove even 2 of those from the battlefield at the same time. If we play all free spells, then our deck is weak to cards that specifically turn that off. One of the most played cards in that category is Lavinia Azorius Renegade. Lavinia Azorius Renegade resolving will turn off our entire deck, and we only have Subtlety and Force of Will as a way to stop it on the stack. In that case, we're going to play Karakas in our sideboard. Karakas can bounce a legendary creature for free as our land for the turn. It's more of a spell, but it takes up our land slot. But if we're not playing a bunch of lands that produce mana, we can play these land spells. Just remember, don't let Vexing Bauble resolve. If Vexing Bauble resolves, we can't remove it. There is still some ways to play through a Vexing Bauble resolving, like playing free Root Wallas that get countered but return Vengevine from the yard. So there are ways to continue battling even if Vexing Bauble resolves, but we don't have to worry about that too much now that that card has been restricted. Fury can help us deal with problematic creatures. Mono White Initiative plays an Anointed Peacekeeper, which is like the previously mentioned Needle, but on a creature. Fury can be a free way to remove it and maybe even another creature at the same time. We've got either Leyline of the Void or Ravenous Trap and Surgical Extraction in our sideboard to combat mirror matches or dredge players. And we can, of course, use our Wasteland as protection against the very powerful Tabernacle of the Pendrel Veil. Many vintage decks will play Tabernacle in the sideboard entirely to beat us and Dredge. If we sequence our Wasteland before we put a bunch of free creatures in play, we can Wasteland a Tabernacle before our creatures have to be paid for. It's going to be very hard for us to pay for any creatures, so Tabernacle can sometimes be a one-sided board wipe. Be very careful and calculated when putting a bunch of free creatures into play against a deck that may board in Tabernacle. But don't worry, if this all sounds confusing, we will go over each and every matchup of the 11 most common decks in Vintage so you are prepared for whatever comes your way. Let's begin talking about the individual game plans and sideboarding versus the variety of decks we will see in the Vintage format. First and foremost, Bug. A Bug deck is a challenging matchup for CounterVine. They have lots of main board answers that are extremely powerful against us. The number one card we're going to look for in each of these matchups is Wasteland. Does our opponent play Wasteland? If our opponent plays Wasteland, they can disrupt our entire engine by wastelanding our Bazaar of Baghdad. If our opponent doesn't play Wasteland, we are free reign to use our Bazaar of Baghdad to establish our engine. So this deck is got 4 Wastelands and a Strip Mine and a Beseiju. So 6 lands that can destroy our Bazaar of Baghdad. Combine that with Deathrite Shaman, a card that can eat creatures from our graveyard, which will stop us from being able to return Squeeze or Vengevines or Master of Deaths. Orcish Bowmaster, a card that punishes our whole entire engine of card drawing and starts sniping off our Root Wallas. Leovold, which completely turns off our card draw engine when it's on our turn. You'll have to start using Bazaar on the opposing turn. There's a lot of cards here to worry about. Psychic Frog is just an extremely large and powerful answer that can fly over our team. And Fatal Push removes non-hollow 1 creatures. If they play any Assassin's Trophies in the main, not only does this kill hollow 1, but it also can target Bazaar of Baghdad as an additional way to combat our engine. Tie this all together with cantrips and demonic tutor, and Bug is a menace when it comes to the CounterVine matchup. Oko, a little bit on the slow side, but if they buy enough time, Oko making 3/3s can be pretty hard to punch through. That being said, we just need to establish what we can do in face of such reckless hate. Number one, mulliganing and keeping which cards we filter with Bazaar of Baghdad is going to be very important. We're going to want to make sure we have backup Bazaar plans. If we have Noxious Revival, it might be a card that we want to make sure we don't discard to Bazaar of Baghdad. If we have a second Bazaar of Baghdad against a deck with no Wastelands, we can safely discard it. But if our opponent has Wastelands, we might want to save our Bazaar of Baghdad to gain a tempo win and play the new Bazaar after the first one is destroyed. We are, of course, going to want to look for hands that do produce fast, powerful creatures. Early Vengevine plays, early Hollow One plays are going to be important here in tempoing out our opponent, especially when cards like Force of Negation are going to be on the weaker side as our opponent's deck is mostly powered by creatures. We do have a kind of more recent innovation inside of CounterVine decks playing 4 main deck subtlety because of the additional emphasis on creatures in the current state of Vintage. Now, we do have cards in the sideboard to help. I would look at bringing in these Furies to help remove the problematic creatures like Bowmaster and Deathray Shaman. These 4 Furies are definitely coming in. And then we have to consider bringing in Force of Vigor if we believe that our bug opponent is going to bring in 4 Leyline of the Void. Now, Leyline of the Void is really the only card that matters to hit off Force of Vigor, but it is a card that matters quite a lot. So the number of Vigors you're going to bring in probably is going to be on how much you think you need to deal with a Force of a Leyline of the Void. Leyline of the Void is a spell that does not go on the stack. It just goes into play. And so you have to have Force of Vigor as an answer to Leyline. Now, you technically can play through a Leyline of the Void with this deck. Hollow One being a 0 mana threat is a great way to play around opposing Leylines of the Void. And you have the counter spells to back up a multiple Hollow One draw and attack that way. That being said, it's going to be a hard time. You might consider bringing in Karakas to bounce Leovold. I don't know if that's 100% worthwhile. I know Karakas is mostly in the deck for Lavinia, and maybe it'll help versus Oath where they play Atraxa. But do you want it against Leovold? That might be a bit too much, but maybe you have enough cards you want to bring out. You're going to bring out cards like Force of Negation, probably, if there are not very many non-creature spells to hit. I've got to be careful on trimming numbers. This deck is playing pitch spells, and pitch spells typically, in this deck at least, will require a card exiled of the same color. So all of our blue spells, Negation and Will, are going to require another blue spell, and Subtlety, another blue spell to be exiled from your hand to cast that. If we start cutting too many blue cards, then it might be hard to reliably cast the Forces and Subtlety. This is also true with green cards and Force of Vigor. So always keep in mind that when you start sideboarding cards in and out, you're going to want to make sure you have still a required number of blue and green spells. The numbers here are going to be different than something like Bug. We talked about last week, Bug being a deck that really wanted, more than 20 blue spells and more than 16 green spells. The numbers are always going to be lower here because you're going to see so many cards with Bazaar of Baghdad. So you can see 4, 8, 12, 16, 18, 19. Actually a pretty high number just because there's so many subtleties in this version of blue cards. And then 4, 8, 12, 14 green cards. Now, you're not going to need to cast Force of Vigor as much as you're going to need to cast Force of Will and Negation. So this makes a lot of sense. But just keep in mind that post-board, when you need that Vigor, you might have to make sure you keep in these green Root Wallas and Vengevines and Noxious Revivals to make sure you can reliably kill the Leyline of the Void. While Bug is a problematic matchup, the CounterVine Mirror is one that is pretty unique. This is a matchup where both sides are going to have a lot of answers, and many games are going to be messy. You're going to have a lot of 1/1s attacking. Game one, it's all about who gets to keep their Bazaar and play the longest, who is able to put their 4/4s down first, how many Wastelands, how many Bazaars you have. You definitely want to be, on the play, activating your Bazaar and then tempoing your opponent out with Wastelands. It is a lot of play draw dependency, and of course, like which spells you draw. Because you mulligan in game one, especially to a Bazaar every time, sometimes you just don't have the right cards to help you in the matchup. So it's going to be a little interesting there. Post board, it's going to get weird because the cards you want post board are many, and the cards you don't want in your deck are also many. So a lot of the time, a post boarded game of Bazaar CounterVine mirrors are going to look like 12 cards come in. I would be looking to board these 12 cards in. Of course, Leyline of the Void, if you have Leyline of the Void, is actually going to be much better than Ravtrap. And then I need to find 12 cards to board out. I actually really like boarding out blue cards. So I like boarding out Negation because they're never going to play non-creature spells on your turn. So that card is already dead. Once I start boarding out Negation, my blue count is going to suffer. And Mindbreak Trap is almost not going to ever be turned on as well. So Mindbreak Trap can go, and at that point, I like to board out Force of Will. I don't believe every player likes to board out Force of Will, but that's something I choose to do. You can try it out yourself and see if you want to keep some amount of Force of Wills in. But because your blue count is going so low, you can't really reliably cast it. It gets a little bit hard. However, if you have Leyline of the Voids in your sideboard, maybe you want to keep Force of Will in as it's a way to protect your Leyline, as it's going to be one of the most important cards in the matchup. So you can see I already have, with Chalice of the Void being dead in this matchup, no 0 drops. Even though our cards cost 0 mana, they do not have a mana cost of 0. So nothing is being countered by Chalice in this matchup. You need to keep all these Noxious Revivals in because you're definitely playing around Bazaar and Wasteland as the most important cards in the matchup. And in the same sense, you want to keep your Mental Misstep in to counter your opponent's Noxious Revivals. Picking another card here, I'm not 100% sure what it would be. Maybe it would just be a Subtlety. Subtlety is going to be kind of weak here. Putting a Hollow One on top of the library is probably not really worthwhile. But this is becoming the case of, like, is Subtlety even going to be better than just playing, like, 3 small Force of Wills here that are not going to be castable very often? I don't know. That would be something you want to ask some very experienced CounterVine pilots. But the main thing I do know for you is that you want to be bringing in all of these cards. Fury is going to help clean up the board. Force of Vigor is going to help destroy opponents' Leyline of the Void. I think these Ravenous Traps that I've taken from the example list are not as common as Leyline of the Void. Leyline of the Void is the one that I see the most often. But Rav Trap is definitely still going to be good here. One of the issues with Rav Trap in this specific matchup is that Rav Trap will not be castable if certain conditions aren't met. So this one is if 3 cards enter the opponent's graveyard from anywhere this turn. If your opponent discards Vengevine, Rootwalla, only 2 cards enter the graveyard, and then they play a Hollow One, returning both Vengevines, and you can't even Rav Trap your opponent. Rav Trap, on the other hand, is very, very strong against Dredge. So that's why you might want to play it in this current metagame where Dredge is the most active deck, and there are not as many CounterVine players in the format. Surgical Extraction, on the other hand, is quite good in this matchup. Taking out Vengevines and Hollow Ones or something similar will make it so there are very few threats left in the deck to win the game with. That being said, also something like wastelanding your opponent's Bazaar of Baghdad and then surgically extracting all of the Bazaar of Baghdad's out of their deck, also very, very powerful, as the Bazaar is the main game plan. So you can see how the CounterVine Mirror is going to end up in some extremely weird magic with a lot of 1/1s attacking, or 4/4s being destroyed. Worth noting that Force of Vigor destroys Leyline of the Void, but it also destroys Hollow One, so it can act as a removal spell if your opponent has a really solid double Hollow One draw. You can remove both Hollow Ones with 1 Force of Vigor, putting you in a pretty favorable position. From CounterVine, we go to the very powerful combo deck Doomsday. Doomsday is a terrifying matchup for a lot of decks in Vintage, but not for CounterVine. This is one of the matchups where CounterVine excels, because CounterVine does all of the things that Doomsday hates. CounterVine has a ton of counter magic for Doomsday's combo. It has a bunch of land disruption in the form of Wastelands and Stripvines, and it also has a powerful clock in the form of Hollow One and Vengevine. Doomsday is a combo deck that's going to cast Dark Ritual into Doomsday, making their library 5 cards of their choosing, drawing through their library, and casting Thassa's Oracle. Like I said, our deck has so many good pieces at beating Doomsday. Basically, all of our cards are good against Doomsday. All of our main deck is good against Doomsday. It is extremely favorable. We have free counter magic. Mindbreak Trap is turned on the majority of the time. Mental Misstep is very good at disrupting the cantrip engine. Wasteland at disrupting the underground seas. Noxious Revival can buy time and turns, especially if opponent goes for a Doomsday combo and can't draw through it with a extreme speed like an Ancestral. You could always Noxious Revival the Doomsday to the top of the library to buy a whole turn. A whole turn in a Doomsday matchup can mean life or death, because a whole turn after a Doomsday has reduced their life total by half means that a Hollow One or a Vengevine is likely going to be lethal. Chalice can disrupt 0-drops like Black Lotus, slowing down the Doomsday player substantially. And then we have an efficient card advantage engine with our Bazaar plus Master and Squee, especially in game 1, where opponent doesn't have any Wastelands to stop us. This matchup is very good, but obviously still losable because Doomsday is a powerful combo deck. Post board, you really don't have many choices. The one thing you need to look out for here is that most Doomsday players will play 4 Leyline of the Void, and most Doomsday players will play 1 or 2 Tabernacle at the Pendrell Vale. So we need to play around Tabernacle post board, and we need to have answers to Leyline post board. It's also worth noting that sometimes Doomsday players play creatures. A lot of the time it's like a Murktide Regent or a Shieldred. If you do suspect your opponent will play a Shieldred, we do have answers for that as well. If you suspect your opponent will play a Shieldred, you may want to bring in Karakas. That would be only if you really suspect they have a Shieldred, or you saw a Shieldred after game 2 and you're going into game 3. That's why it's really important, I think, to either have extremely detailed sideboard guides or not rely on sideboard guides too heavily, because depending on how your opponent builds their deck, your sideboarding is going to change, correct? So we're trying to give you general ideas in these videos, but I don't want you to say that I don't want you to take what I'm saying as the gospel truth and will be 100% of the time, because not only am I not an expert on every deck, but also these people can build decks differently. If opponent has a Shieldred, Karakas is a great sideboard card. If opponent has a Murktide Regent, please don't board in Karakas, right? So you have to think about those kind of things. You are most likely bringing in some number, probably all 4 Force of Vigors, because you just simply need to answer Leyline of the Void. Leyline of the Void is super strong against you, and you need to have answers for it. Vigor probably has to come in for that. And obviously, if you have extra counter magic, like Mindbreak Trap, I would be interested in bringing in Mindbreak Trap. It's kind of an interesting point where Subtlety is not extremely good against our opponent's deck because they don't play very many creatures, but Subtletying a Thassa's Oracle could theoretically be a way that you can win a game. Just by putting it on the top of library. Maybe the opponent used a Black Lotus to cast it and they no longer have blue. That's possible. Simply buying a turn with Subtlety, like I said, can maybe make your Hollow One or Vengevines lethal. Subtlety actually has some game here, and also kind of encourages us to maybe play a little differently. There are some upsides to bringing in Surgical Extraction, not so much anymore, but if you look at this opponent's deck, Undercity Sewers and Island kind of make it not as much the case, but at some points in the history of Doomsday, they didn't play Undercity Sewers, and all of their mana was very much centered in Underground Sea, so you could do things like Wasteland Underground Sea and Surgical all the Underground Seas. You don't see that as much anymore. While you can counter a Doomsday and Surgical all the Doomsdays, Doomsday always comes back with a secondary way to win of Thassa's Oracle plus Demonic Consultation, so I don't really recommend that. And of course, they probably are bringing in creatures if they have creatures in the sideboard. So Surgical is, of course, an option if you have dead cards, but you're really not super likely to have dead cards because all of your cards are so good. I wouldn't want to get rid of Wastelands, but Petrified Field doesn't really have a use here when your opponent is not Wastelanding and destroying your Bazaar of Baghdad. So you could get rid of Petrified Field and find a better card. Maybe you trim on like a Root Walla if you need to fit something in. It's possible Noxious Revival gets worse because you don't need to protect your Wastelands, but you do need green cards for your Force of Vigor, And Noxious Revival can be pretty good at time walking your opponent in certain Doomsday piles, though Doomsday players should try to build with Noxious Revival in mind. So Noxious Revival has some split uses. It has some pros and cons to removing it. Chalice of the Void stopping 0 drops is okay, and it will slow your opponent down, but it's hard to say if that's like super worthwhile. Is it worth a whole slot? I'm not sure. And then again, Subtlety doesn't have targets in post board really, but you could always hit an Oracle, or maybe if opponent brings in that Shieldred or Murktide Regent, a Subtlety can be very good at countering that for a turn. Shieldred usually takes a Dark Ritual to cast, and Murktide Regent takes a very large graveyard to cast, so Subtlety can buy even more than one turn on those kind of creatures that get boarded in. So there's a lot of pros and cons to boarding any of these cards out. You really want to make sure that the cards you're boarding in are worthwhile. This is why it's going to be such a hurt if you board in Karakas to beat a Shieldred and there are no Shieldreds. You're almost always taking out a good card. I would say every card in the main here, besides Petrified Field, is at least serviceable versus post-board Doomsday. Our next deck to talk about, Dredge. Dredge is extremely high play rate on Magic Online right now, even though it is not performing extremely well. This deck is another Bazaar deck and a bit more of an all-in graveyard deck than you. It also requires Bazaar to function, but if you can get Dredgers into the graveyard, it can live with the Bazaar being wastelanded for a little while. This matchup is going to be heavily focused on Bazaars and Wastelands again, and of course, Leyline of the Voids and Ravenous Traps post-board. Game 1 is really hard. The matchup overall can be pretty good for CounterVine, but Game 1 can be extremely challenging because we don't really have a surefire way to disrupt our opponent. Yes, we have the Wasteland in our deck, and we really do need it to be in our opening hand, but we can't always mulligan to the Wasteland. There's a little bit of counterplay here where if both players are mulliganing and Serum Powdering, Serum Powder reveals cards, so you might find out that one or another is playing a Bazaar of Baghdad by the mulliganing with the Serum Powder. And that way you can sculpt your hands to be looking for the cards that are the most impactful. Obviously, we need a Bazaar of Baghdad to function, but we also extremely, extremely important that we have a Wasteland to stop our opponent's game plan. If we don't have a Wasteland, the dredging is simply going to be too fast in almost all cases for you to win. Unless you're on the play with a double Vengevine draw that is like extremely strong, it's going to be hard to beat a Dredge player. That being said, there are draws like that where you discard 3 Vengevines and play 2 Hollow Ones and just attack for a crazy amount on turn 1. But even in those cases, sometimes depending on what they dredge, if they dredge and play some Hollow Ones, maybe they can actually survive from there. A lot of our cards are going to be dead in the matchup. Force of Will is not going to be doing very much. Subtlety is not going to be doing very much. Negation is basically dead. So you end up with a bunch of bad cards and a bunch of very important cards in Game 1. Game 2, you end up with a very similar setup to a mirror, where the cards that are good are going to be very good, and the cards that are bad are going to be very bad. You're going to want to bring in Force of Vigor to deal with Leyline of the Void. A lot of Dredge sideboards will look like this, where they have these Leyline of the Voids. They may bring in Sickening Shoal as a way to remove your creatures, but I'm not even sure they would. Yeah, they might be interested in doing that. And then if they have extra Wastelands and Strip Mines, they'll bring them in from the board if they're not already in the main. I'm a little surprised that this list doesn't have them. This one has 4 in the board. This one has 2 Wastelands in the board. Interesting. Okay, so that's just where the place people are at these days. Especially if you have 5 Wastelands and they only have 2 Wastelands, post-board matches should look really, really strong. It's worth noting that things may play a little differently if you have Ravenous Traps versus Leyline of the Voids. Leyline of the Voids are going to be a little bit less versatile than Rav Trap. Rav Trap can be extremely, extremely hard for Dredge to play against because they need to put cards in the yard, but they don't know if you have Rav Trap. After they dredge, they might hit a bunch of triggers, and you can Rav Trap with those triggers on the stack. Rav Trap timing is not an exact science. There's a lot of nuance, and each individual Rav Trap opportunity has a lot of pros and cons, and it's just something you have to learn as you go. Whereas Leyline of the Void, you just slam it in play and hope it leaves. hope it lives, as your opponent can't really do very much with a Leyline of the Void. That being said, Rav Trap has the ability to be like extremely powerful surprise, especially if the Dredge player is not playing around it. Cards like Noxious Revival become extremely important because our opponent is wastelanding our Bazaars, though it does look like some Dredge players are opting to play less Wastelands nowadays. Maybe with Urza Saga being restricted, they're playing less Wastelands. I'm not exactly sure why Dredge players are not on 4 or 5 Wastelands, but it seems like maybe they have a little bit less. So I guess depending on what you see, how many Wastelands you're going to see, especially if you lose a game 1, it's very likely that the Dredge player went through a large portion of their library. You can actually see what they're working with, though, of course, if they're boarding in a bunch of Wastelands, then hard to see that in game 1. But always be aware of what information you're given in game 1 and game 2, especially if you're going to a game 3. You have 2 full games worth of information, one with post-sideboard information. You need to use that to educate your sideboarding plans. That being said, you're going to do a lot of the same things as the mirror matchup, where these negations are terrible and these subtleties are pretty bad, making your blue card count really low. These traps are going to be really bad. Maybe these forcibles are bad. Chalice of the Void is not going to be very useful. And once again, we're already at like 15 cards to bring in. So obviously we can't cut that many cards because our 15 cards are not all going to be good here. But I would be looking to bring in, you know, all the Rab Traps, all the Surgicals, all the Furies, all the Vigors, and not the Caracas. So at least 12 cards need to come in and out. And you have to decide, you know, which ones are going to be the most effective there. Moving on to Mono White Initiative. This is an interesting matchup because I have heard from both sides of the matchup that they like the matchup. I've heard from CounterVine players tell me they like the matchup. I've heard from Initiative players tell me they like the matchup, which means it's probably an interesting back and forth. One of the reasons I would think that Mono White Initiative has a bit of an advantage is Cavern of Souls. Cavern of Souls, making creatures uncounterable, removes one of the main ways that CounterVine can interact with the creatures. It plays a lot of cost-efficient removals, sometimes 4 Swords to Plowshares, cards like Solitude. Those can easily remove Hollow Ones and Vengevines. Witch Enchanter is a nice little land addition that destroys a Hollow One. Obviously, the initiative creatures are very powerful, but you do need to be careful casting initiative creatures against CounterVine, because the CounterVine player can steal the initiative with the amount of creatures they play for free, especially hasty Vengevines. That being said, Archon of Emeria, making Bazaar enter tapped, can be pretty powerful, though only if you can get it before the Bazaar happens. And then Anointed Peacekeeper might be the most powerful card of all in this matchup, as it is a Pithing Needle effect that's going to make it so that the CounterVine player cannot tap Bazaar of Baghdad, cannot access its card advantage engine, or the ability to play creatures for free. Anointed Peacekeeper is a card that I've always not been a huge fan of in Mono White Initiative. However, it is extremely good against Bazaar of Baghdad. So, when we're thinking about Mono White Initiative, we need to identify that it's Mono White Initiative as soon as possible and make adjustments to how we want to play our counter spells. A lot of the time, if you can tell it's going to be Mono White Initiative, you are going to start countering their fast mana. Chrome Moxes, Mana Crypts, Black Lotuses. You kind of want to use your negations on those because there won't be other cards for you to negate. If they use swords on your turn, you won't be able to force them to negate it. And if they get resolved their fast mana and play a cavern, you won't be able to use Force of Will on their creature. So it's very important to start using, when you identify that it is Mono White Initiative, to try to disrupt their mana base when they start the very first turn. That being said, Subtlety is a pretty strong nod to Mono White Initiative, where this is not a counter spell. So if your opponent does cast, you know, a turn 1 Anointed Peacekeeper with a Cavern of Souls, you could still Subtlety this and buy a turn. Maybe at that point you can have access to a Wasteland, remove the Cavern, and go from there. But you do have some more tools nowadays with the addition of Subtlety. And even Mindbreak Trap can be turned on in certain cases. If opponent goes Mox, Cavern, Anointed Peacekeeper, and you have Mindbreak Trap, no problem, can't be countered. I'm not countering it. I'm going to exile your Anointed Peacekeeper on the stack. So you have lots of different little pieces of counterplay. If you're on the play, Chalice can turn off their entirety of fast mana, giving you a lot of time to build out your Bazaar engine and start wastelanding them. It is, of course, worth noting that this is another Wasteland deck, so you have to play that game plan as well. So not only do you need to be kind of disruptive and stop them from putting their undercosted creatures into play early, you need to be able to have your Noxious Revivals and your Petrified Fields to return your Bazaar of Baghdad if you get wastelanded. This matchup seems like it has a ton of play to it. A lot of different things are going on. There's a lot of different angles happening here. Your main sideboard card is going to be Fury. Fury is going to be great here. Can sometimes kill multiple creatures, and it's obviously free. Worth noting, since this is the first time we're really talking about Fury in depth, Fury is a free creature spell that you can use to trigger your Vengevine. Fury sometimes is in the main, and I would have talked about it if it was in the main, but you can combine a Fury with a Root Walla or a Hollow One to return a Vengevine, especially when Fury clears the way of like a White Plume Adventurer. Vengevine comes into play, attacks, steals the initiative. We don't have a basic in this build to get, but some builds do choose to play a Mountain in the sideboard that you can get with the initiative, and then maybe start pumping your Root Walla, the hidden Root Walla activation in our deck that does not produce any mana. Not as common these days, but it was common in the past to sometimes play a Mountain or even a Forest in your sideboard for matchups with like Ghost Quarters or Initiative. Karakas actually doesn't bounce very many creatures from the Mono White Initiative deck these days. Sometimes Mono White Initiative will play a Thalia. If a Mono White Initiative plays a Thalia, there is some good reasons here to bring in a Karakas to be able to bounce the Thalia. Thalia will obviously taxing your spells can be pretty annoying. You could, of course, pay a Thalia tax by like tapping a Wasteland, but it's not something you really want to do. Mindbreak Trap is a little weird against Mono White Initiative because not all of their hands are Mindbreak Trappable. Some games Mindbreak Trap will never be turned on, and some games Mindbreak Trap will be an absolute all-star. So you kind of have to weigh the pros and cons of that one. Mono White Initiative at the moment is playing an incredibly dense sideboard of cards that are very annoying. Leyline of the Void being the main one. So if my opponent is bringing in Leyline of the Voids, I of course want to answer with Force of Vigors. Archon of Absolution, a pretty annoying pro-white creature that makes creatures have to pay 1 to attack you anyways. This card kind of has to be answered if you want to get in with your creatures. Fury is your big answer to that one. And then Containment Priest, this is more of a hate piece for Oath and Dredge, as it's not actually super strong versus our deck. This is going to make it so non-creatures that enter the battlefield that weren't cast are exiled. Actually, there's only one of those in our deck. Squeeze and Masters go to your hand. Root Wallers are cast for 0. Hollow Ones are cast for 0. Vengevine is the only card that is coming into play and is not cast. Will your opponent bring in Containment Priest against you? It's possible. Depends on how many cards are coming in, coming out. So maybe you have to rely on Vengevines a little less. If your opponent passes the turn with Wood and a White open, maybe you don't want to go all in on a Vengevine plan. Those are some things that you need to be able to keep in mind. It's kind of interesting because certain graveyard pieces that players use are not actually effective versus you. Containment Priest is one of them. Grafdigger's Cage is a huge example. Grafdigger's Cage also only affects Vengevine. But cards like, Leyline of the Void and Yixid Jailer will be much more effective against you. So it really depends on what kind of pieces people are playing. And as the meta shifts away from CounterVine, which it pretty much has, CounterVine, Dredge is the most played deck using the graveyard, and there's obviously a decent amount of Oath in the field. You might start to see less effective graveyard pieces being used against you. Actually, I guess even a very clear example of this is this CounterVine list has Ravenous Traps. Ravenous Traps are probably worse in the mirror for Leyline, but might be better against Dredge. So some of these decks in Vintage are going to get better the worse they are. Continuing to Jewel Shops, one of the most played and winningest decks in the new metagame. Jewel Shops is a crazy all-in combo deck that historically CounterVine was very good against. However, some things have changed that make the matchup more difficult. The big thing is the One Ring. Obviously, it's been a while since Lord of the Rings came out, but when I'm looking over the course of the matchup's history, a large portion of the history of the matchup didn't include the One Ring. The One Ring is unbelievably good against our deck. Our deck does not want One Rings to start happening. It's indestructible, and we don't really have ways to stop it once it's in play. So we have to counter the One Ring on the stack. Now, we do have lots of very strong ways to counter the One Ring on the stack, but once the One Ring enters play and Metamorphs start copying it and making our attacking plan deal 0, we're in a huge amount of trouble. So obviously we are very good against the stack wars. We're going to be able to counter the One Rings and the coveted jewels pretty well, and we will typically have the advantage in the counter wars. That being said, single amounts of cards resolving can swing the matchup incredibly. Post sideboard, you do end up with some cards here like Needles and Cages that you're going to have to remove. Hull Breacher from the sideboard is something you need to look out for. Hull Breacher is a card that you're not typically going to be able to remove because you're not really going to bring in counter magic for it. So it might be a little tough with Hull Breachers turning off your card draw engine. Argenta Masticore is actually not a card we're really able to kill at all. Looking at our deck here, we have all monocolored removal, so we'd have to deal with Argenta Masticore on the stack. Wormcoil Engine is a pretty annoying one to let resolve because our only removal for that will be Force of Vigor. So I think post-board and pre-board games of Jewel Shops versus CounterVine are going to be fairly different. There's a lot of risk for the Jewel player. If they resolve a Jewel, draw 3 cards, and then you're able to counter the follow-up to the Jewel, a lot of times you can actually steal the Jewel with your Root Wallas and your Vengevines and that kind of thing. Not always a play you want to make. It depends on like what your hand consists of. If your hand is like a bunch of counter magic, sometimes you can let a Jewel resolve and then counter the follow-up. You've got to be very, very careful. Obviously, Vexing Bauble is going to be an issue here. But if opponent finds that Jewel is going to be a risk, post-board, what they might do is bring in a bunch of these Argentum Masticores, Wormcoils, and Hull Breachers and play that game plan instead. Thinking in this capacity, what do we want to do? Fury not killing any of their creatures besides Hull Breacher means it's probably not worthwhile. Obviously, Mindbreak Trap is going to be great against their fast mana situation, and Force of Vigor is always going to come in to remove artifact mana and Wormcoil Engine, but it's actually it's interesting how bad Force of Vigor is here. Force of Vigor used to be incredibly good because it was killing Urza Saga. Now with only 1 Urza Saga, you're mostly going to hit artifact mana. Maybe you're going to hit, I'm not even sure. Like it might actually even be not as good as it was before. Something to consider. Subtlety actually might be very useful to be able to time walk a Masticore or a Hull Breacher now. This actually is making me think that I probably should play this matchup a couple times and see exactly how it goes nowadays. CounterVine is a deck that I actually enjoy a lot and I have played in the past, but it's also a deck I hate playing against and a deck that hasn't really existed in the metagame in a long time. Whereas Jewel is a deck that's been persistent in the metagame and has evolved quite a bit in the last few set releases. So just something to think about. Ravenous Trap, obviously not good. I would not bring in Surgical. I probably would still at least consider Force of Vigor, though I want to play some games to see how effective it is. Karakas doesn't really hit anything. So we are pretty much main boarded already for the matchup. Obviously, we have good tools. Playing free creatures with our Bazaar, our opponent is not wastelanding us. We have wastelands to disrupt them. We've got lots of good counter magic against them. Main deck Mindbreak Trap is extremely strong against them. They might even have to play slower so that they play around your main deck Mindbreak Trap. Subtlety topping on Phyrexian Metamorph seems pretty interesting to me. Like we talked about, if you let a Jewel, like say you have a creature in play, they go for a Jewel, you let the Jewel resolve, and then they go for like a Metamorph to copy the Jewel, and you Subtlety the Metamorph, that might be a game-winning play. That being said, I don't recommend letting Jewel resolve ever, but there are situations where you can. Just something to think about. Yeah. So Noxious Revival is an interesting one here, maybe for time walks. If you like counter your opponent's say when your opponent keeps a hand with fast mana and 2 payoffs, and you counter both of them, and then you wasteland them or something, maybe you can buy a whole turn with a Noxious Revival. Chalice of the Void on the play might be pretty good at slowing them down, though Chalice of the Void is not always going to be the best against Jewel. It really just depends on if their hand has a bunch of 0-drop mana or not, and that's kind of just a toss-up. So, and actually an interesting matchup, I think. Historically, I would have said very CounterVine favored. Nowadays, with the One Ring and the way they're building Argentum Masticore Wormcoil sideboards, maybe not so much anymore. The fact that Argentum Masticore is protection from multicolored. Oh. So you can vigor it. All right, never mind. I almost want to just leave that all in. Reading the card explains the card. Argentum Masticore here, chat. Protection from multicolored, not protection from monocolored. That kind of changes a lot of the things that I was saying. I might leave it in just because it's good to have something that's wrong in the video so people commented on it. But Force of Vigor is going to be great here then. If your opponent is bringing in Argentum Masticore, then Force of Vigor is going to be insane. So bring in the Force of Vigor. I still don't think you're bringing in Fury. Fury is only going to kill Hull Breacher and Argentum Masticore, and doesn't really kill Hull Breacher the time you really need it. You want it to kill a Hull Breacher before your like Bazaar gets countered by the Hull Breacher, and Fury doesn't have flash. Something to think about anyways. But I still think the One Ring is the most meaningful card change in the history of this matchup. So be on the lookout and don't let those One Rings resolve. Lurrus Control. Lurrus Control, the best deck in the format. How does our deck square up against Lurrus Control? It doesn't look good. It does not look good for the CounterVine player. The biggest reason, of course, 5 Wastelands, but also 4 Orcish Bowmaster. Orcish Bowmaster making it so whenever we draw a card, Orcish Bowmaster pings something and amasses an Orc +1. It's really, really annoying for our deck. Our deck entirely involves around drawing extra cards every turn and playing some small creatures. If an Orcish Bowmaster's army gets too big, it'll be impossible to get through. It'll start picking off our root wallas. Orcish Bowmaster is super annoying. So much to the point that I have seen CounterVine lists in the past play Gut Shot as an instant speed free way to destroy an Orcish Bowmaster. Psychic Frog is also not a threat that we want to resolve or let resolve as the CounterVine player. This card can be extremely large and then start flying over. This, even though Vexing Bauble and Urza Saga are restricted, both of these cards are in the deck as one-ofs and can be problematic for us. We don't actually play too poorly into Fatal Pushes and Spell Pierces, so that's kind of nice. If the white removal suite of Swords to Plowshares is much worse for us, Swords to Plowshares is very good against Vengevine and Hollow One, Fatal Push not so much. So the blue-black version of this deck is probably worse off against us than Esper would be, but you know, it's about split 50-50 right now which one you're going to be able to play against. Negation is turned off, but a lot of these other spells are still on, and obviously Wasteland and Bowmaster are just going to make for a very tough matchup. Post-board, and even in the main, you might see things like a Nihil Spellbomb or Soul Guide Lantern still. Even with only one Urza Saga, the power of this card in the mirror for the Lurrus player, exiling yards and being returnable with your Lurrus and drawing a card, it seems like Nihil Spellbomb and Soul Guide Lantern are here to stay in the main of Lurrus, at least until the mirror starts to reduce in play percentage. Post-board, things don't get better. Tabernacles are pretty common. More Soul Guide Lanterns and Nihil Spellbombs and Pithing Needles are common as well. And if your opponent is really on top of their game, they might even play 4 Leyline of the Void as a way to shore up their Dredge matchup. I would say that is not very common. It's something that I recommend, but against the Esper version, you're more likely to see Containment Priest, as it's a nice spell against Oath of Druids. Containment Priest is a lot less harmful to us than Leyline of the Void. Some of these lists are going to play Yixid Jailer, which is harmful to us and we have to remove, but it really just depends on the pilot. So this is why, again, you never want to take exact sideboard guides. You need to adapt and see what your opponent is doing. You want to know what the baseline stock version is to gauge your, initial sideboarding plans, but you also need to be alert and seeing what is my opponent bringing in. So what can we do? Well, not a whole lot. In the main, we don't have a lot of great ways to answer a Bowmaster besides countering it. So we have the Force of Will and the Subtlety as ways to counter a Bowmaster. Of course, our tempo game plan is going to be very important here. We want to get the Hollow Ones and Vengevines in as soon as possible. We want to maybe wasteland them off the ability to play mana. Some of these decks don't play the full Moxen set, so if you start to hit their lands, it can be hard for them to play the Psychic Frog and the Orcish Bowmaster in time. It's all going to be about making sure you get underneath the Orcish Bowmaster and Frogs and get tempoing and get into a place where you can counter their spells and attack for lethal. It's tough. It's going to be very challenging. Obviously, they're going to be wastelanding you as well, so you might not even get one Bazaar You might get one Bazaar activation, but you might not even get a second Bazaar activation if you don't get to return it. They could counter your Noxious Revival on the way to returning it. There are a lot of ways this can go wrong. Post sideboard, you have some options. If they are playing white, you definitely want to bring in Karakas. Karakas is going to be necessary to beat Lavinia Azorius Renegade and will have extra help versus Lurrus. If they were on blue-black, I probably would not bring in Karakas just to beat Lurrus. That doesn't sound like the way I would engage the matchup, but I would definitely bring in all of these Furies. It's a bit annoying that Fury might not kill a Psychic Frog every time. If they have enough, I think you only need 3 cards to pitch to the Psychic Frog. Fury might not even kill it. That's really, really problematic, but maybe you can attack, force a block, and then do a Fury. But you probably need this Fury to deal with Orcish Bowmaster. Like I said, sometimes people have even played things like Gutshot in the past as different ways to beat Orcish Bowmaster. But again, it's going to be very important you keep an eye out on which cards your opponent's bringing in. If your opponent is not bringing in Leyline, and the easiest way to tell if they're bringing in Leyline is if they reveal Lurrus. So if they reveal Lurrus, they didn't bring in any ley lines. Obviously, that's going to be not so useful in the second game, but if you go to a third game and your opponent didn't reveal Lurrus in the second game, you know they brought in ley lines, and if they brought in ley lines, you're going to have to bring in Force of Vigor. If you don't think they're going to bring in ley lines, then I would probably not keep in a lot of Force of Vigors. Force of Vigor will only really hit like the one Urza Saga, the Soul Guide Lantern, and the Cage. Cage doesn't even hurt us that much, but if they have a Needle, Needle does hurt us. So you probably need to keep in 2 Vigors at least, but then if you see them not reveal Lurrus, you want to bring in all 4 Vigors because you don't want to get ley lined. If you see things like Yixid Jailer, you definitely want to make sure you have your Furies in to kill the Yixid Jailer. So lots of things to think about in that matchup. You need to make sure that you are on top of checking out what cards they are bringing in and out. You want to see, if you are on Magic Online, of course, you can always look up, their latest lists and see what kind of cards they tend to have in their sideboard. But you want to be keeping track of what cards the blue-black and also the Esper version are typically playing in their sideboard when you go to do these kind of maneuvers. After Lurrus, we've got Oath of Druids. Oath of Druids is kind of a weird matchup for the CounterVine deck because it's definitely CounterVine favored, but Oath has some tools. This is actually kind of a funny matchup in my mind because it's a matchup I lost in the top 8 of Eternal Weekend last year. I played the traditional Oath Show and Tell list with Atraxa, and my opponent was on CounterVine, and I got run over. It can absolutely be a bloodbath. This is going to be an example list of an Oath player. The biggest deal is Oath of Druids and Show and Tell. These are your 2 non-creature spells that cheat into play Atraxa. Atraxa resolving is a big no-no. If Atraxa resolves in game 1, you're dead. Because this thing is flying, lifelink, vigilance, death touch, 7/7. Very, very hard to get around for the CounterVine player. That being said, the fact that Oath of Druids and Show and Tell are both non-creature spells that go on the stack is actually very good for the CounterVine player. The CounterVine player gets to counter those spells with all of the counter magic, Force of Negation. Force of Vigor is even a counter for Oath of Druids because that takes a full turn. So you have a lot of ways to combat what's happening on the Oath side, and Oath's other cards are just not that strong. Oath doesn't usually play very many ways to disrupt your Bazaar engine in the main. Sometimes we'll play a Strip Mine, which I popularized because you really did need that way for Oath to be able to beat a Bazaar deck in game 1. But you can also have Besage You. If you have enough fast mana, you can use a Besage You to destroy a Bazaar. So the Oath deck has the tools, but it's not as well-oiled machine as something like Lurrus. It's not always going to have the right answers. It's going to be a lot of variance in that regard. So although it has powerful spells and Atraxa is usually game-winning, it can really depend on the draws. That being said, post-board, Tabernacle is likely to be in the sideboard for them to tutor for, so you gotta be aware of the possibility of a Tabernacle wiping your board away. This one has a Surgical Extraction, but a lot of lists have Leyline of the Voids. You're almost always going to bring in the full 4 Force of Vigors in this matchup because it's so good against Oath of Druids in general. So it's a little annoying for the Oath player that the best graveyard hate is typically Leyline of the Void. Maybe you'll see some Leyline of the Voids get turned into Ravenous Traps as Dredge becomes a higher metagame share. But you should always have your Leyline of the Void covered because you're always bringing in Vigor for Oath anyways. Something worth noting is that sometimes these decks will add in 1 or 2 Serra's Emissaries. Serra's Emissary is not beatable. If Serra's Emissary resolves, it names creatures and you lose. Unless you have a very specific answer in your deck. Traditionally, Snapback. Our deck is not currently playing a Snapback, but sometimes in the past, CounterVine lists have played Snapback. Here it is. It is a pitch spell that returns a creature to hand. This spell was traditionally used because of Tinker for Sphinx of the Steelwind and other things like that. It's not in favor right now just because there's not a lot of tinkering happening. But if you do find yourself in a metagame that has a lot of tinkering for creatures like Sphinx of the Steelwind, Snapback is your answer. It's also going to be your answer to a resolved Serra's Emissary. That being said, post-board, if your opponent is putting in Atraxas, you can Karakas an Atraxa, and sometimes that is enough. If your opponent show and tells an Atraxa and you show and tell and you put a Karakas into play, you bounce the Atraxa and you can attack for lethal sometimes, that may be good enough. So Karakas is very strong post-board here against these Atraxas, but obviously doesn't do anything against Serra's Emissary if your opponent brings that in. Now, it's worth noting, not all Oath decks have the Serra's Emissary, so you're still always going to bring in Atraxa and Force of Vigor because they're going to be good against. Sorry, you're going to bring in Caracas and Force of Vigor because they're going to be good against Atraxa and Oath. That's probably it. I don't particularly find Mindbreak Trap to be extremely effective against Oath, but you actually might have to burn in Mindbreak Trap because Subtlety is basically completely useless. Very few games are going to go to 7 mana where your opponent casts Atraxa. That does happen, but I wouldn't say it happens very much in this matchup. Though boarding out Subtlety here is, comes with the price of reducing our ability to cast the blue spells. So things to think about. You can probably get rid of Noxious Revival here, or maybe trim Noxious Revival, and maybe you do just end up playing the other Mindbreak Trap to up your blue count. Mindbreak Trap absolutely can be turned on against Oath, but it's not always going to be turned on. A very common sequence would be something like Mox, Oath, you force the Oath, they force your force, and you trap the stack. So I actually was not thinking about this a little more. Maybe Mindbreak Trap is turned on more often because of how much you're going to engage in stack wars. So I would actually, let's go back on that thought and say maybe you do want to bring in Mindbreak Trap. So Mindbreak Trap, obviously Force of Vigor, and Caracas. These are all going to be very good cards in the matchup. And you probably don't want anything else. It's very easy to identify that this deck is not, though it is a creature-centric combo deck, it's not really casting creatures or putting creatures into play normally, so you don't really want to play, Furies and that kind of thing. A side point worth noting is that we talked about how Caracas tempoing on Atraxa can be worthwhile. Don't make the mistake that Subtlety can tempo on Atraxa. Subtlety can only target creatures and planeswalker spells that are on the stack, not things that are in play. So Subtlety, like I said, is not very good. Not going to be very good here. You're going to want to be able to board it out unless you think your blue count is so important that you want to keep it in. Chalice of the Void can be very good on the play, though I would look to maybe try to board it out on the draw. The Oath deck does use Moxen extremely well, so it's very powerful on the play, but on the draw, it's probably just not worthwhile. You can maybe board out the Petrified Field as well, just because there's not that much Wastelands. Like, they are playing, 1 Strip Mine, 2 Boseiju, but that's not the same as playing, 5 Wasteland effects in the main, so lots of things to think about, and just like maybe tweaking numbers here and there. But obviously the big things that are going to matter here, Caracas, Force of Vigor, and the counter wars over Oath and Show and Tell. Moving on to a very strong matchup for the CounterVine deck. Paradoxical Outcome and Esper Tinker in general is historically a very, very good matchup for the CounterVine player. It's hard for the PO opponent to fight on the stack to resolve its main game plan. PO on the stack, and also the ability of having all of these Moxen be Force of Vigorable is going to be very, very challenging. The PO player does have some good options. Obviously, Force Swords to Plowshares can be very strong at slowing down Hollow Ones and Vengevines, but the real issue is going to come with the fact that you don't have the Wasteland effects to stop the card advantage engine of Squee and Goblin Nabob. Squee and Master of Death. Those cards are going to increase in value as you continue to pitch them and give more cards into the hand of the CounterVine player, countering all of the stuff that PO wants to resolve. Monastery Mentor is a very good piece in this matchup. So there's that. And I think a PO player playing Leylines is going to give you the best chance to stop the Bazaar engine. This is going to be a simple counter and tempo matchup for the CounterVine player. You are not going to have to focus too much on Wastelands. You are not going to have to focus too much on people attacking your Bazaar. You want to keep up your hand count and be able to counter all of the really powerful things that the PO or Tinker player is doing. Obviously, you want to counter Tinker, PO, Monastery Mentor. You're going to have to probably counter Teferi, that kind of thing. But you can attack their Planeswalkers with Vengevines and Hollow Ones. And in general, you just have a lot of really good answers. Mindbreak Trap as well. The PO player is going to try to play PO on your turn. The reason is because Force of Negation and Force of Vigor can only be cast on the PO player's turn. That being said, a lot of times Force of Vigor might happen on an end step, and there might still be a fight. All of the timing windows don't really favor the PO player, and you can pretty much force the issue as a CounterVine player. It is worth noting, though, you should be very careful about Force of Vigor on their turn where they have enough mana to PO back the Moxen in response. You don't really want to allow that to happen. That being said, if you have enough counter magic, maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe you can force them into a position where the mind break trap happens. You vigor, they've cast some spells. You vigor, they cast a spell. You mind break trap. You get all their moxin. Lots of good things going on here. Obviously, Chalice is going to be very strong in the matchup. Bringing in mind break traps, vigors post board is going to be good. If you see Lavinias at all from the opponent, you're going to bring in Caracas. Obviously, your opponent has to be playing Esper variant of PO or Tinker for Lavinia to matter. But if you see Esper, you probably should just be bringing in Caracas to hedge against the possibility of Lavinia. Very few players opt out of Lavinia, so there's usually one or two of those floating around. You're not really going to be interested in Fury. There are some Esper Tinker builds that are looking at more Hull Breachers and White Plume Adventurers. Those matchups, maybe you do bring in Fury. It's a little bit hard to say if that's really the thing you want to be going for. Subtlety might be just a better tempo answer that gives you a higher blue count. That it might be more useful than putting Furies in your deck that may or may not be good depending on which creatures your opponent ends up playing. In general, the onus is on the PO player or the Tinker player to try to resolve something broken before you gain too much advantage by drawing cards with Squeeze and Master of Deaths. That's basically the entirety of the matchup. If the PO player resolves something good, it can be bad for you, but if not, you are going to just tempo them out with an unending card advantage from Bazaar plus Squee and just a huge swath of counter magic to counter their really powerful things. One of the harder matchups for CounterVine is Sphere-based Workshops. Now, Sphere-based Workshops can be one of two different decks, really. It can be an aggro variant or a prison variant. The prison variants are typically much more challenging, but the aggro variants can be hard in their own right. The big issue is going to be, one, wastelanding on your Bazaar, and two, Sphere of Resistance making your spells cost one more is going to turn off a large percentage of your deck. All of our cards are going to be a lot harder to cast if we're under a Sphere tax. We might even need to have a Wasteland to cast the spell. Hollow One will actually still be fine under one Sphere. You can cast that for 0. But once you get to a second Sphere, then it's going to be a bit challenging as well. So it's really important to not get locked under the cards like Trinisphere and Sphere of Resistance. That can be kind of hard sometimes. Obviously, they're on the play. They're playing things above rate with Workshops and Ancient Tombs, so it's going to be pretty challenging. The version that's attacking with creatures can get out of hand really quickly if you don't have the right setup. But the version that is more Golos and land toolbox based with Crucible of Worlds, that one is going to be an even more challenging matchup. Let's go quickly find an example of that as well so you can see both of them. So here's a more prison-oriented version. This one's got Crucible of Worlds to bring back Wastelands. It can go find, Ghost Quarters and Wastelands and Strip Mines. Sometimes it even has Bajuka Bog that it can tutor for to exile your graveyard. Vexing Bauble is going to be turning us off if there are no spheres in play. And Golos as a 3/5 creature can be pretty large. That being said, we have some tools in this hard matchup that makes it better. Obviously, countering on the stack is going to be really strong. They're not going to be able to counter your spells. So if you pick the right spells to counter, you can kind of run away with the game that way. Being on the play and playing a Chalice can be pretty good. Stop their Moxin base. Wasteland and Strip Mine of your own can hit their Workshops and slow them down that way. Sometimes they'll play, Ancient Tomb Sphere, and then you Wasteland their tomb, and then they can't cast from underneath a sphere either. So there can be some play that way. Obviously, being on the play is going to be very important here. Getting your creatures into play early is going to be very important, as your opponent's going to start restricting your ability to cast creatures and other spells, and obviously attacking your Bazaar of Baghdad. You're definitely going to want to keep the backup Bazaars or the Noxious Survivals to bring back Bazaars, because they will play, at least 5 Wasteland effects, if not more. They can play Ghost Quarters and other cards like that, so it can be pretty challenging that way. This is one of the matchups where it's going to actually hurt you to not play your 4 Vigors in the main. Vigors are, sometimes 2 to 4 in the main, depending on the metagame. Sphere Shops is definitely at the back foot in this metagame. It suffered very hard from the restriction of Vexing Bauble and the restriction of Urza Saga. Sphere Shops has not found its footing in the new post-restriction metagame. So two Vigors make sense in the main to me, but it's definitely going to hurt you to not have all 4 Vigors. Force of Vigor is very good in this matchup. Force of Vigor is extremely good at beating any kind of, aggro or prison-based colorless Workshop deck. Even if they resolve a sphere, you could still play a Wasteland and Vigor on their turn, paying for the sphere tax. Now, if they resolve a Trinisphere, you're probably not going to be able to resolve through a Trinisphere tax, but don't let that one resolve. Fury will probably be good in the matchup with all the creatures, the aggro shops variant, where they're playing things like Steel Overseer and Hangerback Walkers and Ravagers and Phyrexian Revokers and these kind of, Foundry Inspector. I think you would probably want to bring in Fury in that matchup, but I wouldn't really bring in Fury against the more prison-oriented list. The prison-oriented list has the 3/5 Golos, but even the Patchwork Automaton is going to be a bit of a challenge here. The Patchwork Automaton means to remove it, you have to pay the ward cost, and you're just not going to have the mana to pay the ward cost because we don't play mana here. Karakas for Golos is an interesting thought, but probably not something I'm super interested in. You might bring it in though, just because Karakas can help you pay for that sphere tax. So against the Golos version, I would consider bringing in Karakas. You probably are going to have some cards that are less powerful anyway, so it might make sense to board some cards out, like a Chalice on the draw. But you are going to have to bring in these Vigors, and these Vigors are very important. You sometimes will want to keep Mental Misstep in, depending on the hate you think is in their sideboard. So it really is going to depend. Let's take a quick example of what we have here. This one has Leyline of the Void, so you really need those Force of Vigors, and it has 1 Needle, 3 Cages. We went over how Cage is not that good against us. It's only stopping Vengevine, but it's still stopping Vengevine, so, it could be worthwhile. But this is a Needle and a Lantern and 3 Cages. There's a possibility you just want to keep in Mental Misstep because it's going to hit all of these important 1-drop spells. Take a quick peek at this prison shops list here. 3 Cages, Leyline of the Void. So basically everyone, there's a lot of Leyline of the Voids happening right now based on the number of Dredge in the current metagame. So you're always going to have those Vigors in post-board for these Leyline decks, especially decks that are not running Lurrus. This one has some Warp Coil engines, which you're going to need to have answers for in the form of maybe Subtlety, maybe Force of Vigor. It kind of depends. Historically, these matchups are hard because Sphere is affecting you in a very meaningful way, and we don't usually have the mana to pay for spells, so the Sphere tax is really, really strong. And if an opponent has the Crucible Wasteland, it can be very hard to get your engine going. So you definitely don't want to see a lot of Sphere Shop matchups, whether they be aggro or prison, but thankfully there's not a lot of them happening in the current metagame. The last matchup we are going to talk about in this video, Underworld Breach, a slightly different deck than Esper Tinker or PO. There are some things to look out for here that are very specific. Hull Breacher is an annoying card in a very similar way to Orcish Bowmaster. It is harder to cast, but being able to turn off your Bazaar Baghdad and gain treasures instead is extremely powerful. Dak Faded, another interesting one. Not the best in the matchup as we don't play very many artifacts, but stealing a hollow one can be extremely annoying if our plan is to attack our opponent for lethal. So you got to keep an eye out on Dak Faden stealing your hollow ones, Hull Breacher stopping your Bazaar, and then of course just be aware of what combos your opponent is presenting. Tinker for Bolas' Citadel, play through your deck. Underworld Breach for the Brain Freeze Black Lotus combo, milling out. And sometimes Hull Breacher plus Time Twister Wheel of Fortune, where you'll have to discard your whole hand and your opponent will gain a new hand plus 7 treasures. Post board, a lot of these decks are playing Leyline of the Void. That's going to be your main concern. They're going to be playing, this one has a ton of Needles. Needles need to be removed as well. Tabernacle is usually a tutor target that you're going to have to play around. And then, of course, sometimes these decks even play a Sphinx of the Steel Wind to Tinker for. So a lot of things to think about. You never really want to let Tinker resolve. Tinker resolving is going to be bad for you no matter what. That being said, this is probably a matchup where I'm going to have 4 Force of Vigor in anyways for Leyline, but it's also going to be very good against Underworld Breach and Bolas' Citadel. So this is a matchup where we want Force of Vigor. Probably a matchup where we're interested in bringing in extra Mindbreak traps as well. Their combinations are not always going to be trappable, but if you're fighting over the stack, then the trap will be turned on more often. I don't believe I would want to play Fury just for Hull Breacher, but if you really wanted to, you could consider bringing in some amount of Fury as ways to beat a resolved Hull Breacher. I think Subtlety helps you play around Hull Breacher in a very meaningful way. Subtlety in the main that you might not really want to play Fury. Obviously, Chalice on the play here, pretty good. Your opponent is a very, very heavy Moxen deck, so the Chalice is going to be very good. You're not going to need the Petrified Field because your opponent is not playing Wastelands to attack you. So you're seeing a lot of the similarities as we go here. If your opponent is not playing Wastelands, you don't need the things that beat Wasteland. If your opponent is not playing, spells, you don't need the things that beat spells. So Pretty straightforward. You definitely you're not. Again, we're in that weird spot where your Noxious Survivals are not going to be very good against your opponent's deck, but you probably want to have some Noxious Survivals so that your green count is high enough for Force of Vigor, so you can Force of Vigor Leyline of the Void. Force of Negation actually is going to be really strong in this matchup. One of the better Force of Negation matchups because you're going to hit Time Twister, Wheel of Fortune, Tinker, Dak Baden. You're actually hitting a lot of really important spells. It's one of your better Force of Negation matchups. So a lot of the similar things that are happening in some of these other counterspell decks. Nothing to hit off of Karakas here because our opponent is Grixis. That's why it's really important to evaluate when you see like, oh, you see an Underground Sea, but did my opponent play Grixis cards or did they play Esper cards? Because it's really going to dictate some of the cards you might want to bring in. If you do have Snapback in your 75, this is probably a matchup where you want to bring in Snapback. Same as the Esper PO matchup. I don't think I brought it up during the PO matchup, but if you do have snapbacks and you think your opponent might tinker in a Sphinx of the Steel Wind, pretty good matchup to have snapback for. And then in this one, it does double duty where snapback can bounce on Hull Breacher, so you don't get completely ruined by a Hull Breacher turning off your Bazaar of Baghdad. And that brings us to the end of our matchup segment. I hope you have answered all your questions. If not, you feel free to comment below and we'll try to find the answer for you. As always, you should join the Discord where you can answer questions directly to people who play the deck. With that, we're going to move to the final section of this video where I play a example match and show you some CounterVine gameplay. All right, welcome to our CounterVine Vintage Vanguard match. We are on the play versus Sai here. I have a Bazaar of Baghdad, which is the #1 thing. We need to make sure we find a Bazaar of Baghdad. I also have a bunch of free power. The big point to notice here is we don't have counter magic, so this could be a huge problem. We'll have to see. That doesn't really mean that we can mulligan. If we have a Bazaar of Baghdad in our opener, almost every time we are going to keep the hand. I know there are some instances in like the mirror post board where there are definitely some hands you might be able to get away with, but for the most part, we're going to mulligan and make sure we have Bazaar. Now, I'm a very lucky gamer. I have 2 Bazaars in my opening hand. My opponent mulliganed to 6 and did not reveal Lurrus. Going to I'm going to tap the Bazaar. I'm going to put the Squee and the Root Walla and one of the 3 Wastelands in the yard. There's something to be said about keeping the Root Walla in your hand so that you could maybe return a Vengevine with it later, but we're pretty far from a Vengevine, and we'd have to find a second creature. I feel like it's more likely we end up wanting to have an additional Wasteland, so definitely keeping our Force around because we want to build towards a Force, and I'm going to keep the second Bazaar around in case we get Wastelanded. So I'm going to just pitch the Squee, which will start gaining us, negating the card disadvantage, turning our Bazaar into Faithless Looting. And I'm going to play the Hollow One because I really just need to tempo my opponent out. Hopefully our opponent does not play a One Ring or Coveted Jewel or something very powerful on turn 1 where we don't have access to Force, but we'll have to see. Island. Key. All right, that signals to me they're either, it's either a weak Coveted Jewel hand or an Esper PO hand, or Esper Tinker or Grixis Tinker, one of those kind of decks. So on our upkeep, we get our Squee. We return it to our hand. We're going to draw, so we have more cards to choose from. Pre-combat, we're going to access our Bazaar here in case we find Vengevine, though we don't have enough creatures for the Vengevine. In this case, I no longer think that do I need a second Bazaar? So that's another question. We're definitely pitching the Squee. We can't Wasteland an island, which is annoying, but we do have a Force now. The question I'm asking myself is, do we want a second Bazaar? Now, if we had found another Squee or Master of Death, maybe it would have made sense to try to use 2 Bazaars, but 2 Bazaars is really going to accelerate our card disadvantage, and our opponent isn't likely to have a Wasteland from this point, so I'm leaning towards getting rid of the second Bazaar, and again, I still think a second Wasteland is more useful than trying to hold a Root Walla. So I'm going to get another Root Walla in play. I'm going to hold up my Force. I'm going to play the Wasteland. It'll help against maybe an Urza Saga or something similar. I obviously don't have a green card for my Vigor, but I do have a very fast clock, 4 turns of attacking. My opponent has a pretty full grip, though. 1 Force might just not be enough. We'll have to see. Ancient Tomb. Okay, so my opponent is on Jewel. Tinker. Well, I have a negation. Always better to use the negation. Doesn't cost you life, and it has less targets. Do they have force backup for their Tinker? They do not. So we win. This is a great example of how this matchup can go. Say they say they go workshop One Ring here and they have force backup and I have no other answer, then the game becomes really hard. But because they didn't have backup, their hand was a little bit on the weaker side. We were able to counter their one spell. We were get to wasteland their Ancient Tomb, attack for 6 or so. Maybe we can get a green mana and it's going to be a downhill for them from there. So I think a pretty good example of exactly how we want to go for a tempo game plan. We're going to put these free creatures into play, and we're going to counter our opponent's spell. Now, this is a cool matchup, and this is actually the matchup I actually wanted to play while going through the matchups, because it's one I haven't played in a while, and one that I think has gotten worse over time. So what we're going to do is we're going to bring in these Force of Vigors, and we're going to bring in Mindbreak Trap. And I'm not really interested in Fury, Surgical, Rab Trap, or Caracas. Now, if I do identify Argenta Masticore as an issue, maybe we can bring in this Fury. But I'd rather just use the Subtlety for the Argenta Masticore so I have more blue cards to pitch to my blue counter spells. Petrified Field can come out because they're not attacking our mana, but all of our Wastelands and Strip Mines are still very important for our tempo game plan. Chalice on the draw is interesting because Chalice on 0 does help against them comboing off, but it's weaker on the draw. I'm inclined to keep the Chalice in, actually. But that might be wrong, but it's something I'm inclined to do. And then Mental Misstep is an interesting one because do we want Mental Misstep? It might hit some of the cards that are coming in, like Needle. But in general, there are not like that many good hits. So lots of things to consider. I don't know if there's a perfect answer. I'm going to trim 1 Noxious because I don't think Noxious is quite... I'm going to trim 2 Noxious and leave the Mental Misstep and the Chalice. Now, this is maybe on the riskier side because we're going to reduce our green count a little bit, but the card is just not that great in the matchup. So I'm going to try it like this, but there's definitely arguments to a variety of different 3-card switches there. Another opening hand with a Bazaar of Baghdad. I am confirmed a Lucky Wizard, and I do have Counter Magic in this time. Obviously, Subtlety is not the best counter spell versus them, but it's pretty good against Phyrexian Metamorph. And then I do have a Mindbreak Trap to prevent something terrible from happening on turn 1. Obviously, I'm going to keep my hand with Bazaar, and we're going to battle. I have a way to make the Bazaar mana card neutral with this Master of Death. Ooh, Inventor's Fair is an interesting one. And I have Clock with these two. It's a pretty strong hand. My opponent has kept some fairly weak hands, I would say. These hands are not exactly inspiring. A lot of the times with Jewel, you want to find a turn 1 ring or a turn 2 Jewel hand. We obviously draw our Mental Misstep after they played their 1 card here. So now the question is, am I interested in wastelanding this Fair for tempo? I don't think so with how much use we're getting off of this Bazaar activation. I definitely don't want a Serum Powder as it does nothing. This Master of Death is not pitching to anything. I guess it could pitch to Subtlety, but we already have Mental Misstep to pitch to Subtlety. So I'm going to get rid of the Master of Death to offset the card disadvantage. I'm going to get rid of the Root Wallet because I wanted to come into play. Now, a question will be, how much do we play around Tabernacle of the Pendrell Veil? And that's a card that will, if they play the land, it's going to wipe our whole board away. I can wait and play less hollow ones and use the Wasteland to play around it, but I kind of want to play for tempo, and I have a Master of Death already to just like use the Bazaar as a card advantage engine. So I would rather, in this specific spot, go for the hollow ones, both of them. If my opponent takes a turn here and they play the Tabernacle and wipe my board, it's not good for me, but it's also not the end of the world with our Master of Death. If we didn't have the Master of Death, then I think there's a lot more interesting choices to be made there. So my opponent has a Mana Crypt, which I cannot counter. If they play a 1 ring here, it's just really bad for us, right? Because I have this Subtlety that does not counter the 1 ring. They're going to make a mana with the Voltaic Key. Would have been nice to counter the Voltaic Key, but it looks like it probably won't be a 1 ring then. Argenta Masticore, maybe? Oh, a Mightstone Weakstone. Interesting. I wonder if my opponent is on some kind of... I mean, this is a very Jewel card. It's good. So it's going to either enter the battlefield and draw them 2 cards, or it's going to -5/-5 a creature. It also makes 2 mana. So, oh, it's going to draw cards. Very bold. Maybe they have a Tabernacle. If they do go for another card this turn, we have the Mindbreak Trap online. So if they go like... They haven't played a land yet. They could go Workshop the 1 ring, which would be pretty good for us, in my opinion, as we would be able to counter it. Though we are getting to the point where they have so much mana that our Wasteland is not very good. That's a problem. So they have 4 cards in hand. What are we looking at? Non-artifact, no non-artifact spells. So this is going to be a Metamorph as the last spell. So this is something I can subtlety, but I think the Mindbreak Trap is less likely to be online and costs less cards. So I'm going to go with the Mindbreak Trap on the Phyrexian Metamorph here. Manamo. Okay, so not a Tabernacle. So that's good. So we have a 2-turn clock here with 9 damage and 18 life. I guess it's not exactly a 2-turn clock because there is an Inventor's Fair which gains 1 life, but there also is a Mana Crypt that could lose 3 life. All right, let's return this Master of Death. Draw a card for turn. Another Subtlety. Activate our Bazaar. A Vigor, but no green card. Unfortunately, if these Subtleties were forces, I would feel really good about this spot. But they're not. So I'm thinking Master, Misstep, and a Subtlety in the yard. Because all I can hold is 1, 2, 3, 4 cards. And I'm definitely looking at just wastelanding this fair so they can't tutor for something or gain a life. And I can't keep double blue cards, so I guess a misstep is more useful than another subtlety, right? So let's get rid of 2 subtleties, a master, and then wasteland the Inventor's Fair. Obviously, if they now draw a Tabernacle, it's annoying, but... And then I'll half their life total with 1 swing, and then we'll see what happens from there. I'm not feeling very confident about this spot because I've drawn all the subtleties instead of the forces. If I had drawn Force of Will, I think I would have felt pretty good. But let's see what opponent has for us here. 5 mana, 6 mana. Jewel then. Jewel's really good here. Yeah. Not much I can do about this. Draw 3. We have just not really drawn the correct set of counter magic. Obviously, subtlety is just not a Force of Will. A good thing subtlety does here is I can time walk a Metamorph, though, if they go for a Metamorph on Jewel. They did go for a Metamorph on Jewel, so I'm going to try to subtlety this Metamorph and hope they have no more action in their hand. If they have more action in their hand and they can draw the Metamorph, then that's just it for us. But if this is their last piece of action, it's just enough to squeak by. I'm not very hopeful. It's interesting that the opponent chose to use 2 life to play for this Metamorph when they had access to a lot of blue mana. Kind of an interesting choice, but maybe they don't think the life points matter. Let's put this card on the top or bottom of your library. I assume they'll put it on the top. They put it on the top. All right, well, I'm done. I don't have anything else. I could have a Mindbreak Trap from the opponent's side, but if they just have another Metamorph, then they have another Metamorph. Or if they have a Jewel, they have a Jewel, and they probably win from there, but we'll let them play it out at least a little bit. Let's see what they have for us. A One Ring is really good for them because a One Ring buys them a full turn and lets them do a Metamorph on Jewel next turn. I obviously can steal... Oh. Okay. I obviously could steal the Jewel in that spot, but probably not enough. All right, if they're going to bounce it all to their hand, I don't think we can realistically win from this spot. So opponent's going to keep doing things that draw them cards until they hit the point where they have a Time Vault and a Voltaic Key and take infinite turns and then win with a Karn or anything, really. For the sake of the video, I'm going to let them play through it at least a little bit here so you guys can see what a Coveted Jewel deck looks like while it's comboing off. But I would say from this spot, we are pretty much locked to be dead, and you could realistically concede. So yeah, subtlety, not it. If subtlety was a counterspell that could counter the first Jewel, I think it's likely we would win this game, but there are only so many free blue counterspells in Vintage and Magic in general, so... But we did see, there was a distinct possibility there that subtlety putting the Metamorph on the top of the library, if opponent has no other spells, it would have been enough. We can concede from here. Opponent has an Urza Saga in their deck and a Karn in their deck, so they'll take infinite turns and then eventually kill us. I guess theoretically, opponent could have Urza Saga and Karn as the last like 2 cards or something and lose. But if I'm playing in an online tournament for entertainment, then we can concede from there. If you're playing in Eternal Weekend, by all means, make your opponent play it out. Yep. We're going to run it back and see how it goes. All right. This time we did not draw a hand with Bazaar, but we have a Powder. Unfortunately, we're going to lose a large swath of very good cards in the matchup. Some players may ask the question, is it ever right to mulligan? Are the cards so good that you wouldn't Powder? And I find the answer is almost always no. You're almost always going to use the Powder because having a higher number of cards in hand is usually going to be more important than having like the best cards in your deck. That's a Powder. This is also a Powder. This is another Powder. We've lost a lot of cards. Let's take a quick thing. We're going to lose 3 Root Wallas, 2 Vengevines, a Master, a Subtlety, a bunch of Forces. And then our 7-card hand didn't have a Bazaar. We only had 39 cards. All right, mulligan. This one had a Bazaar, and this is a great hand, though. This is an amazing hand. I'm going to keep this hand, and I'm going to bottom the Wasteland in this point, because I'm going to try to maximize Masters. All right, play my Bazaar, activate my Bazaar, another Bazaar. So I'm going to just get rid of Master, Squee, and Bazaar. And the reason I'm not going to pitch 3 Bazaars, 3 Masters, or 3 Squee effects, I should say, is because I do want to have a blue card to pitch to Force the Will here. So I'm going to get rid of this 3rd Bazaar, and I'm going to play a hollow one, and then I'm going to have a bunch of counter magic. And then every turn that this game goes past the first turn is going to be very advantageous for me because my Bazaar is going to be drawing so many cards a turn with Squeeze and Masters. We'll see how it goes, though. My opponent kept 7 on the draw with a very powerful combo deck. Let's see what they have for us. I, of course, don't want to have to use Force of Will on this turn because I want to keep this Master, but it seems extremely unlikely that to be the case. My opponent has Mox, Workshop, One Ring, one of the strongest starts that it can have. I have Force and Master, but if they have Force of Will backup, I do have that covered with Mindbreak Trap. It's unfortunate I lose my Master here, and it's also unfortunate I bottomed a Wasteland, but those are things that you have to do to play the game. All right, upkeep. Let's return our cards. Let's draw. Noxious. Noxious could return our own Force here, which is a consideration. It would be one of our 2 cards that we draw is Force. And then we would have to consider... Yeah, I mean, it seems like a thing I would like to do. Just make sure that I have another piece of counter magic this turn. It's a really card disadvantage, though. But the problem is if I draw 2 and I don't hit a Force, it could be really bad for me, right? So let's put the Force on top of our deck. I'm not sure this is correct. This is just my gut instinct. As always, this is your disclaimer that I am not perfect. Vigor. All right, so I'm going to just keep Force and Trap and put 2 Squeeze in the yard. So at least I've guaranteed myself here a Force. And my opponent should understand that I've also guaranteed myself a Force here because I pitched Master. So they should know my other card is a blue card. If my other card was not a blue card, I would not have pitched Master. So... my opponent should understand that their next spell is getting forced. So we'll see what they do. I would say I'm actually in a little bit of trouble just because I haven't really established a huge advantage from this spot. That's like partially due to the fact that I didn't have... I mulliganed and then couldn't keep the Wasteland. It's a little tough. Now, if my opponent plays a spell here... I'm going to trap it because it'll be 1 less card used and it'll make, we'll have more cards to use for the next turn. And we'll also guarantee we have a Force next turn because we can always keep the Master. This has been a great game, actually. I've been very lucky. This is the first game I recorded of this deck, and I've been lucky that the first game has been good. So I don't have to worry about recording another match here. Blue, white, artifact, spring, untapped or not untapped? Untapped. Hole Breacher. 4 mana after. Alright, well, I'll trap it. You have a force backup. Then it's Hull Breacher versus 0 cards. Okay. A ring backup would be extremely powerful here, but it doesn't look like they have it. So they have 2 cards left. We still got to keep our force. I would say that turn went extremely well for us. Cashing in a Mindbreak Trap is always going to be good. Subtlety. Activates. Rootwalla, Misstep. All right, so I'm going to pitch Master, Rootwalla. I'm going to hold up Force, Subtlety, and Misstep. This Rootwalla is actually really important as it changes the clock. Right now, the clock is 4 attacks with Hollow One, but the Rootwalla is going to make it 3 turns. So this Rootwalla actually very strong. This match has been really interesting. Very nice, classic CounterVine gameplay. Might even get into concession this turn. We'll have to see what opponent chooses to do. They know I still have Force of Will, and I pitch Master of Death, so they should assume I have a Force. At no point in this time have they had a backup Force for their play. Time Vault. Time Vault doesn't do anything right now, so I'm absolutely letting the Time Vault resolve, especially with Mental Misstep countering a Manifold Key or Voltaic Key, the 2 combinations with Time Vault. All right, my opponent is going to let me have another turn here. Like I said, every turn that we put 2 masters, 2 squee effects back in our hand, we are just gaining so much advantage. Master and squee come back. Draw. They could have, obviously, a Hull Breacher here. I think we would just counter a Hull Breacher and be okay with it. I actually am thinking that maybe we don't even activate right now. They're dead on the next swing. And then if they play in combat, we can activate in combat. I kind of like the idea of just waiting now. There's like very little chance we return a Vengevine, so I don't see any reason to play into a second Hull Breacher right now. Though they did play Hull Breacher on their main phase last time, so. Now, if they don't play a Hull Breacher, I'm going to activate in their upkeep. All right, sweet. I successfully played around a Hull Breacher here. This is like a really, really big play from me because now I don't even have to counter this Hull Breacher because I'm winning on board versus the Hull Breacher. I get to make my response, activate my Bazaar, get... Okay, I didn't have a second creature spell to return the Vengevine, so it's... Oh wait, I would have subtletied the... I could have subtletied the Hull Breacher and maybe returned it with Vengevine with Root Wallet. That's crazy. So now I'm going to actually pitch squee. Interesting. Hold on. Let me think about this for a second. So I could theoretically subtlety this Hull Breacher and then return a Vengevine. I don't think that's as good as having subtlety force up, though. So what I'm going to do... So I have lots of options here because I have so many cards. I could theoretically go... Squee, Rootwalla, Vengevine, and then Subtlety the Hull Breacher, return the Vengevine, having an overwhelming presence on my board. I could go Squee, Rootwalla, Squee, getting another Rootwalla in play, which is going to, the clock is going to be longer, but then it gives me the ability to have Force and Subtlety up. The thing is, I think if I Subtlety my opponent right now and play the Vengevine, I don't think they're going to put it on top, which means I only have 1 piece of counter magic for my opponent, which maybe is enough, but I don't know if I'd rather want to risk that. So, or I could just not put this Root Wall in play because it's not actually changing the clock. My opponent has to block Hollow One next turn no matter what. So what I can do is I can go Squee, and Vengevine. And let this Hull Breacher resolve. This Hull Breacher does extend the game by a turn, but I think extending the game by a turn with 2 squeeze is okay for me. I'm not sure, though. Maybe this is, like, too risk-averse. But I do feel like not using my Bazaar was a really good play by me. We'll have to see. The opponent is in top deck mode, and I have multiple pieces of counter magic, though, which is exactly what we want to see. Is this a Jewel? Jewel. So yeah, I'm gonna force this pitching Master because I feel like Mental Misstep still has a lot of value right here. I guess I could pitch if it's pitching Subtlety, but just gives me less options. So then they have to pass the turn to me. I return to Squeeze. If I draw for turn and my draw is a Root Walla, I can actually activate Bazaar and return Vengevine and win, which is kind of interesting as well. I guess I can actually do that anyways because I have a Subtlety. Is that worth it? So I can activate Bazaar, ditch Root Walla Squee, cast Subtlety for nothing, returning Vengevine and attacking for lethal. It gives my opponent 2 treasures, but it doesn't give them anything that they can do. I guess they can cast PO. It would give them the ability to cast PO. But I actually don't have counter magic right now. The other thing to do here is obviously if I just attack, they have to block the hollow one, and then post combat I get to activate Bazaar, wasteland them, but I don't have a counter spell right now. Okay, so I think I'm going to. What can I get punished by? A Dismember? A Dismember would really punish me. They'd cast it for free. They would Dismember the hollow one. They would trade with the Vengevine. I would still be winning from that spot, though. I can just cast this, right? Even if there's nothing to... Yeah. Blue, white... All right, I'm going to try it. So my 2 draws are replaced by my opponent getting 2 treasures. I then have to discard 3, where I'll discard Root Walla Squee. Cast my Blazing Root Walla. Cast my Subtlety. Return my Vengevine. And attack. Very risky play here, but I think it makes a lot of sense. I'm not really sure what I would get punished for with this play. I guess a second Hull Breacher, but then again, they would lose both their Hull Breachers. Interesting. Very cool game. If I had another force in my hand, I would never make this play. All I would do is I would attack and I would get my value and I'd be able to counter their next spell off the top. If I had another force, I would never make this play. But the fact that I didn't have a force makes me want to see how this will play out this way. Just puts it on my opponent. They need to have a second Hull Breacher or a Dismember. I guess they could theoretically have a PO for 4, but no, they have nothing. I don't know if we're going to be able to draw a card and see. We're not because there's a Hull Breacher in play. But we got there with a little bit of a trickery at the end here. I could easily be convinced that some of the choices I made in the end there, where I had a lot of options, were not correct. So let me know if you think any of those choices were ones you wouldn't make. But I think given the board state and the cards in hand, they made a lot of sense. Here, if they did like survive, I would probably wasteland the workshop to cut off their mana the most possible ways, and then hope I don't get top decked. I still have a very good chance of winning because say they played 2 Hull Breachers and block both of these. Obviously, the hollow one is still going to be alive, so that's winning on the next turn. Say they play a Dismember and they kill the hollow one and trade the Vengevine. I still have 2 Root Wallas, which win in 2 turns. So that's still possible. And I'm still returning Squeeze from my hand on the next turn. So that was an awesome match. I hope you all enjoyed it. I hope you have enough information now to be able to play CounterVine if you so choose. Obviously, it's not always going to be a strong meta call. But it is a deck that vintage players love, and it is a very vintage-specific deck. You are not going to find this experience anywhere else in Magic. New vintage videos on this YouTube channel every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and make sure you check out the other 11 parts. I guess there's 10 other parts. The other 10 parts of this Vintage Vanguard series as they air on my YouTube channel. I will see you then.